Think about a decision you made that changed everything. Maybe it was a relationship you walked into or walked away from, a city you moved to, a job you didn't take, a moment where the path split and you chose one direction over the other. Now ask yourself something most people never stop to ask. If you had chosen differently, if everything had gone another way, would you still have become the person who you are today? That is the question this video is going to explore. Hi, I'm Lisa. Welcome back to Biblical Reality Check. If you've watched the mustard seed video in this series, you heard a question hidden inside that parable. What is already inside something before it becomes what it's supposed to become? Everything the mustard seed will be is already encoded in what it is. The soil can be poor or rich. The rain can come early or late. The seed can be planted deep or barely covered, and still the seed grows into the same tree. That image of encoding stayed with me because I started to wonder whether consciousness works the same way as the mustard seed. I wanted to know whether, like the mustard seed, our consciousness has a similar blueprint that steers us through life to make us become the people we are. I'm not talking about a destiny in the mystical sense, nor a script that we follow. I'm talking about a structural pattern, an internal architecture, if you will, that is present from the beginning, that steers us in a certain direction despite the choices we make, the environments we are raised in, the people we interact with, and the cultural and societal influences that help shape us. Developmental psychology has a word for what's encoded in living systems before growth begins, and that word is potentiality. It refers to an individual's unrealized capacities, abilities, and traits that are not yet fully manifest but are capable of emerging through maturation, education, and experience. Potentiality is basically the full range of what an individual is capable of becoming, not as a vague possibility, but as a structured readiness. It is a fact that we are not born as blank slates. Research on temperament, neurological wiring, and early behavioral patterns consistently shows that certain ways of processing the world are observable within days of birth, before language, before culture, and before relationships have done their work. Sensitivity levels, attention patterns, the way a nervous system responds to novelty or threat, tendencies toward introversion or extroversion, and even early ethical intuitions, what researchers call moral foundations, all show up in infancy. These signature traits are not the whole person, but they are the architecture inside the seed, so to speak. And here is what's worth considering. The patterns did not ask for your permission to exist. They were already there long before you understood any of it, shaping what caught your attention, what hurt you deeply, what excited you, and so on. Systems theory could be a way of explaining this. Systems theory is a framework that describes how living systems organize themselves. And within that framework, there is a principle called equifinality. The word comes from the Latin, meaning equal end, and it describes what biologist Ludwig von Bertalanffy observed in living systems in the mid-20th century. Unlike machines, where the final outcome is entirely determined by starting conditions, Bertalanffy found that living systems can arrive at the same endpoint from radically different starting points through radically different routes. What Bertalanffy's research showed is that the system self-corrects. It orients toward its stable form, not because the path is fixed, but because the destination pattern is already present in the system itself. In other words, the system finds its own way. When you apply the principle of equifinality to consciousness, to the development of a person, it raises a striking possibility. Across a single life, even as circumstances change, certain patterns tend to persist. People move through very different conditions: seasons of stability and support, seasons of instability or loss, periods of ease and encouragement, periods of struggle, disruption, and reinvention. And yet, across those changes, researchers repeatedly observe the reappearance of the same psychological signatures, the same ways of perceiving, reacting, and organizing meaning, not because the path was fixed, but because something more stable appears to be organizing the journey from within. This is not something we can prove by rerunning a life, but it is something we can recognize by watching patterns persist through the changes that take place in a single life. One way to think about it is through music. Take a single melody and play it on different instruments: a piano, a guitar, a full orchestra. Each version sounds different, but beneath those differences, the melody itself remains identifiable. In that analogy, the instrument is life circumstances, childhood, environment, and relationships, and the melody is the person's deeper psychological structure. However, I want to be clear: this is not about fatalism. Fatalism says the outcome is locked, that your choices are meaningless, that you are being carried by a current you cannot affect. But that is not what the research suggests. It suggests something more nuanced. The research shows that your choices are real and they shape the outcomes in your life, the relationships you build, the pain you carry, etc. But it also shows that beneath those choices, there is something that keeps orienting you in a certain direction, keeps pulling you towards certain kinds of questions, keeps making certain things matter in ways you cannot fully explain, and keeps reassembling your essential direction even after external circumstances scatter it. Although the paths you take may change, the deep structural architecture of who you are becoming remains more stable than you might expect. This is what makes some people feel, when looking back on their lives, that even the detours were somehow necessary in getting them to where they are. Not because the detours were in any way planned, but because the pattern inside them used everything it had, including the wrong turns, to find its way there. But this all brings me to another question. What if the choices you made freely were themselves expressions of the patterns within your consciousness? What if the relationship you chose, the one that seemed like a free decision, was selected by something inside you that already knew what it needed to experience? What if the struggle you keep returning to isn't a failure of willpower, but a signal from the patterns, pointing you towards something you haven't yet been willing to look at directly? This is where consciousness studies and developmental psychology converge on something uncomfortable. We may be less the author of our lives than we believe, and more the expression of something already present in us, something trying, through every circumstance, to become fully itself. What this tells me is that we are not blank slates, and we are not fixed scripts. We are something more like structured possibilities unfolding through lived experiences. From a systems theory perspective, we are localized, self organizing expressions of the universe's deeper patterning, operating at the scale of a human life. That is not a diminishment of human agency. It is an invitation to ask a different question. Instead of what should I choose, ask what is already choosing through me. What is the pattern that keeps asserting itself regardless of the surface level decisions? What does it want? What is it moving toward? Because if equifinality is real, and if the pattern inside consciousness is stable enough to find its way through radically different circumstances, then understanding that pattern is one of the most useful things a person can do. But here is where I need to be careful. Recognizing that you carry a pattern is not the same as becoming passive and letting it do its own thing. A musician who understands their instrument does not stop playing, they play with more precision. When you begin to see the pattern inside your own consciousness, you stop spending energy pretending the instrument is something it isn't. You stop trying to become a version of yourself that the pattern was never oriented toward, and you start working more precisely with the structure you were given. I'd invite you to try this exercise. Look back at the last 10 years of your life, not at what happened, but at what keeps coming back. What themes have repeated, regardless of how you tried to resolve them? What keeps mattering to you, even when you tell yourself it shouldn't? What keeps pulling your attention toward it? Those recurrences are not random noise. They may be the pattern in your consciousness, pointing you toward what you are already becoming. The parable of the mustard seed shows us how something small carries the full blueprint of what it will become. Our next video on the parable of the leaven will show us how transformation happens from the inside, quietly, until the whole is changed. And this video is the connective tissue between them. You are already what you are becoming. The path was never the point. The pattern is. And that pattern, repeating across every circumstance and choice, functions as your internal compass, continually orienting you toward the state your mind recognizes as alignment. Thanks for watching.